Good morning to everybody who is tuning into this webinar from the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. My name is Kevin Rudd, and I am president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Because of COVID-19, I'm speaking to you now from Queensland in Australia, which is where I grew up, and I've come home for the duration until normality is restored. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world today, whether it's afternoon or evening, whether you're in the rest of Asia, whether in the United States, or whether you happen to be in Europe, or during the daytime here in the Pacific Island region itself. I'm delighted to be joined by two good friends and colleagues who are known right across the Pacific region for their contribution to public life. Firstly, we're joined by Dame Meg Taylor, who is the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Meg is, apart from being Secretary General of this important grouping of 16 independent and self-governing states, she's also the first woman to hold this role. And Meg, knowing something about the culture of the wider region, this is a significant achievement. And so I congratulate you on your ability to keep the blokes under control. Furthermore, Meg has also had a distinguished career in the PNG, Papua New Guinea Public Service. She began her professional life as private secretary to Papua New Guinea's first chief minister, Michael Somare, who then of course became prime minister. And then since then has worked as Papua New Guinea's ambassador in various important postings, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico. From 89 to 94, she became the Vice President and Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for the World Bank Group. That's from 99 through until 2014. So Meg, you join us with a distinguished career background, and the position you currently hold as Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat is an important one, which those of us in the region are well familiar with. So welcome. Meg is joined by Ralph Regenvanu MP, who is the leader of the opposition in Vanuatu. Most recently, he's been the Foreign Minister of Vanuatu. He was elected to Parliament in 2008. He's also served a number of other ministerial capacities, including as Minister for Land and Natural Resources. That's when he initiated a major overhaul of land laws in Vanuatu aimed at enshrining the jurisdiction of customary law to determine rights to customary land and the free, prior and informed consent of traditional owners to dealings on their customary land. From 2013, Ralph was co-chair of the National Sustainable Development Plan Core Group, which is responsible for developing Vanuatu's National Sustainable Development Plan for 2016-2030, which was launched in early 2017. Ralph is also an inaugural committee member of the Indigenous Partnership for Agro-Biodiversity and Food Sovereignty, which was founded back in 2010. Before entering Parliament, Ralph was director of the National Museum and director of the National Cultural Council of Vanuatu. And so Ralph and Meg, welcome to this webinar. It's part of a series that we are doing with the Asia Policy Institute in New York, looking at the wider Asia-Pacific region, and the common thematic is the impact which the COVID-19 crisis has had on each of the countries and regions of the wider Asia-Pacific area. As we know, COVID-19 has had a dramatic global impact. It has also had dramatic regional impact across the Pacific Island countries. The Pacific Island countries have, however, achieved enormous success in keeping to an absolute minimum the impact of the disease itself in terms of deaths and infections across many vulnerable countries in the region. Meg will speak to this presently. But whatever success has been achieved on the public health front across the wider region through wise decisions by national governments supported by the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, the economic impact across the wider region has been huge and devastating, not least because of the collapse of international tourism to the Pacific Island countries. And as a consequence of that, projections from economists of unemployment levels across the Pacific Island Forum countries of between 20 and 30%. and Meg will be attending acutely to what you have to say on that. We noticed, Meg, that the Pacific Island Forum enacted the Bikatawa Declaration, which is rarely used in the history of the Pacific Island Forum and has only been drawn upon in times of genuine security crisis across the wider region. And I'm sure you'll be speaking to that in your remarks as well. But finally, quite apart from the public health impact of what's occurred with the COVID-19 crisis among our brothers and sisters in the Pacific Island countries, and quite apart from the devastating economic consequences and employment consequences, neither of these things remove the ongoing challenge of climate change for some of the most vulnerable countries in the world. Not just Tuvalu and Kiribati, which often take central billing in the international community on this because they are such low-lying countries and subject, therefore, to coastal inundation acutely, but other countries across the Pacific Island region as well. Ralph will speak to us about one of the most recent manifestations in terms of Cyclone Harold, which has inflicted such extraordinary damage on his country. And so with those opening remarks, I'd like to turn to our two guest speakers. Our format for today will be very simple. Meg will speak for 5 minutes or so, providing an overview from a forum secretariat perspective on these big challenges which the region faces. Ralph will then speak to the same from his capacity as a significant political leader within the region. And then after 10 to 15 minutes or so, I will lead an open discussion with the two of them on various of the issues which they have raised. And then I will use my hardy Australian iPhone to take communications from my office in New York in terms of questions which are being posted online from those of you who are tuning into this webinar, so that I can then pass those questions back to Meg and Ralph for their comments. And we will conclude hard on the hour so that everyone can get to their normal day. So Meg, welcome to our webinar. Welcome to the Asia Society. We look forward to your comments this morning. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and greetings to you all from a beautiful day here in Suva, Fiji. I just wanted to create the context of where I'm speaking from. The Pacific Island Forum has 18 members now, 16 are the independent states, and we have 2 territories that have joined the membership of the Pacific Island Forum. Of these 18 members, whose EEZs cover 14 million square kilometers of the Great Pacific Ocean. So the narrative of the Pacific Island Forum is that we belong to a blue Pacific continent. It's a narrative that reinforces identity, our connectedness to each other, our culture, journeys across the ocean for the seafaring countries, and of course, our strategic importance. But the blue Pacific states live with vulnerabilities related to distance, isolation, and also because we are dependent on outside economies, but we also have very small economies of our own. What we live with, the greatest vulnerability, and Ralph will be speaking to this in more detail, is climate change. This is the one existential threat that we never forget. And just recently, with Cyclone Harold coming through Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji, it was a very poignant reminder that you can be worried about other things, but climate change will always be with the Pacific unless the world does something about it. So on the arrival of COVID-19 into the Pacific, the reaction or the response of our member states was very abrupt. Immediately, countries closed off their boundaries. And now we have 6 countries that have COVID cases. We have 12 countries that have no cases at all. We have 9 states that still have a state of emergency in place. And today, most of our boundaries remain closed. So you may wonder, what have we done in terms of response? So the responses have been 3-pronged. Firstly, the Pacific Island countries have reached out to their development partners and requested assistance, particularly to provide medical supplies and financial resources. And to a large extent, that support has come through, but there is still a great need for medical supplies. finance ministers have secured financing assistance from multilateral development banks and development partners. Secondly, with regard to health supplies, we have the Joint Incident Management Team, which is led by WHO and very ably supported by the SPC, the Regional Technical Organization of the region. And their role is to coordinate and secure the medical supplies that are going to be needed for delivery into the Pacific. The third one, where my institution, the Pacific, or our institution, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, is more involved in, is what is referred to as the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway. This was created by the Pacific Island leaders, the triggering of the Bikatawa Declaration because of this enormous calamity that we're all facing together. And the purpose of the humanitarian pathway is to create that political environment so that when countries ask for help, there is the ability to be able to get support into those countries. It takes more than just an aircraft landing to get medical supplies to a country. You need to make sure that the protocols are there that protect the country itself. So there is protocols needed for the deployment of technical teams, issues around customs, issues around immigration, repatriation, and also diplomatic clearances. So this is the work we're doing right now with the member states to make sure that that is in place. And as countries need medical supplies, then that can be deployed. So the continuing challenges that we do have is that we really need more personal protective equipment. And fundamentally, we need resources to be able to move them from point A to point B. We have a lot of supplies at Nandi in Fiji, and we need to get them through to other countries. And looking forward, of course, is the challenges of opening up our economies again. Economies that have taken a huge hit, and I'm sure people have questions around this, but the economies that have depended very much on tourism, there is a loss of jobs. Jobs have been cut. You've also got the impact on transport, hotels, agriculture, on retail. All this has meant that the GDPs have been substantially impacted. And the countries that have really been hard hit are the Cook Islands, Vanuatu, Palau, Fiji, Samoa, because tourism contributes between 20 to 70% of their GDP. The other area that we have concerns about, and I mean, it's hurting, is the tuna fisheries industry, which earns a lot of money for the Pacific country. It's hard hit because of the restrictions of transport, delays in licensing fees, quarantine restrictions, etc., the closure of ports, and the partial closure of processing plants. So all this means that the economies are really suffering. From within the environment that we live in here, we see people without the support of having a job. And the loss of jobs means that you can't support your families, and our social security systems are not comprehensive enough. Within the Secretariat, our economists have indicated that there will be a decline of 5.9% in the regional real GDP, which is equivalent to about $605 million US. But if you include the economy of Papua New Guinea in that, which is quite large, then it'll be about 950 million. The social impacts is going to be something that we and other institutions are working closely on to see just what has happened and the impact on our people, and that's going to be a substantial piece of work. But the country responses have been interesting. Immediately, the countries have initiated stimulus packages. Multilateral banks have been approached for financing, and that's been available. But what we really do need is more grant financing, and we need deferment of payments of debt. And we also need development partners to look at vulnerability as part of the index when countries go to get loans, that the vulnerability of the Pacific is very different from many other parts of the world. I could go on a bit more, but there's more things that need to be said about the climate issues, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, thank you very much, Meg, and we will come to climate in our Q&A. But thank you for that overview, the role of development partners, the functioning of the WHO within the region, your Pacific humanitarian pathway, your immediate needs in terms of PPP supply and distribution. And then on the economy, the particular projections for the most vulnerable states, and then that alarming pan-regional number of a effectively 6% contraction. And you roll in PNG, about $1 billion contraction in terms of the pan-regional economy, with obviously is not just a number. This is about real people's jobs and real people's livelihoods. So thank you for that overview, and we'll come to climate in due course. Ralph Regenvanu, tell us the perspective from your part of Melanesia, as you would see these issues which Meg has raised. Over to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Kevin, and greetings to everybody who's watching or listening around the world. It's also a beautiful day here in Port Vila, Vanuatu, and we are blessed to be one of the few countries in the world that has not got any positive COVID-19 cases, no infections to date. It was around the second half of March that airlines stopped flying to Vanuatu, Qantas, Virgin, and then our own airline lost the capacity to fly. And then we shortly thereafter closed our borders, and they're still closed today. We enacted a state of emergency. I'm saying we because I was in the previous government, which finished on the 20th of April, so less than a month ago. So we were in the middle of all this as well, caretaker government mode, elections. And so on about the 3rd or 4th week of March, we closed our borders. And then at the end of March, Vanuatu became the first Pacific Island country to announce an economic stimulus package, which is quite a significant package aimed at stabilizing employment, providing wage support to people who lost their wages as a result of COVID, as a result of tourism dropping. And so tourism in Vanuatu makes up between 40 and 50% of GDP. And we've lost almost all jobs in the tourism sector. So you can see the huge impact border closure has had on one of our principal industries. And then it was around this time also that tropical cyclone Harold hit the north of the country. And so the north of the country is where most of the agricultural production is located, particularly the main crops, which are coconuts and kava. There was a direct hit on the south of Santo Island, Malo Island, and Pentecost Island, which are some of the main suppliers of these commodities that make up most of our agricultural production and export. So it's been a double hit in terms of the economy. Tropical cyclone Harold was, of course, a Category 5 cyclone, so one of the strongest we've experienced since the strongest since Tropical Cyclone Pam in 2015, and devastated the north of the country. And we are still trying to respond. Response was made all the more difficult because we could not bring people in because we had closed our borders. We were not allowing people in. We did not have test capacity to be able to test people for being for what their COVID status was. So without allowing anyone in, there was also complications about the kind of relief that could be brought in. So we have our development partners responded. They responded with funding. They responded with relief supplies, but the relief supplies are very much complicated by the COVID situation and questions on our side as to how safe was it to bring relief supplies in. There was all sorts of advice there about how we could bring relief supplies in. And one of the complicating factors was our National Disaster Management Office basically requiring quarantine of relief supplies for up to weeks, which very much delayed these relief supplies reaching the people that were supposed to reach. So we now have a situation where we are about 2 months into the border shutdown. We're about 6 weeks post Tropical Cyclone Harold. Assessments are being done. Preliminary assessments have been done, but the final assessments have not been done yet. relief is starting to reach people. Food relief has gone out, water relief. Shelter is still a big issue, not reaching people. The twin crises, as these crises do, have exposed a lot of weaknesses in the government system, a lot of weaknesses in our health delivery system, in the bureaucracy of disaster response, disaster recovery. And so these are additional factors that are coming into play when we're talking about trying to meet these crises in the best way possible as a government. Just recently, an issue has emerged where the new incoming government has changed aspects of the economic stimulus package, particularly the employment stabilization program. They've made changes to who is eligible. This was just last week, which is now causing a huge backlash from the private sector, who were expecting employment support for all affected employees. The new government's just basically changed the goalposts and said no, it was only for the tourism industry, which has caused a major outcry because, of course, almost all employees in all industries have been affected by the slowdown in the economy. And the other question, of course, is we don't know how long this is going to go on. So the current economic stimulus package goes till the end of June. We are now in our third state of emergency, the first one being 2 weeks declared by the president under the Constitution to respond to COVID in particular. The second was a 30-day state of emergency. And now we're into our second 30-day state of emergency, which responds to both the COVID pandemic, but also tropical cyclone Harold, but also there's been a large part of the island of Tanna affected by ashfall from Tanna volcano, which is also causing a humanitarian crisis on that island. So what's happening now is we're trying to find the best way forward to respond. I am now leader of the opposition, obviously, so we made a statement yesterday calling on the government to reconsider its changes to the employment stabilization program because they were not a change in direction from the government on what it initially indicated to the private sector. The private sector, of course, are enormously important partners in the development of the country, and there's been a failure in a confidence in the government as a result of this change. So these are issues we are raising with the current government. We're trying to work alongside them to improve the effectiveness of response. Luckily, we have not got any COVID cases yet because our health sector is very challenged. We're still building up to this state where we will be able to deal with COVID cases if they come into the country, but right now we are not ready at this stage. We are perhaps 1 week away or 2 weeks away from being ready to deal with any cases. Hopefully we will not experience cases, but of course we're ready. And just today, an Australian Air Force plane is flying in relief supplies for TC Harold, but also our first cartridges so we can do tests for COVID. So this is, 2 months later, we finally today going to be receiving the cartridges from the World Health Organization, funded by Australia and New Zealand, which will provide us with capacity to test, which is what the former government said was the requirement to start repatriating about 200 of our citizens who want to come back right now to Vanuatu. So we are finally in the stage to start talking about how are we going to repatriate our citizens. Most countries have done it. We were waiting for the test capacity, which we just got today. And of course, it isn't operational yet. We've just got the cartridges in place. And only 220 of them at this stage. So I think there's a lot of challenges ahead. We continue to see how we're going to find a way to support our economy. Talk of this bubble, the Trans-Tasman bubble or the Pacific bubble, is very encouraging, but to echo the words of the Samoan Prime Minister a few days ago, we will require people to be tested before they come to the country. And that is going to be, at this stage, that is mandatory from our side. So if that cannot be done, there's going to be a problem with eventuating this bubble. great thanks go to Australia and New Zealand for allowing the thousands of our workers who are working on the recognised seasonal employment scheme in New Zealand, the seasonal work program in Australia, and also now the Pacific Labour Scheme. They have allowed us to extend their visas, given them new contracts. So they're not so much a problem. But at some stage, we're going to have to get those people back or think about how we're going to maintain that those labour mobility schemes which serve our countries so well as Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Island countries. These are all issues that we need to start thinking about as we perhaps move towards an end to border closure. Perhaps now that with the second wave being announced, it may not be that soon, but we are looking forward to finding a way to get our economy going, maintained. We're in a situation now where the government has given relief, tax relief, in terms of all the taxes and fees that need to be paid by a business or any ordinary individual. We've suspended tuition fee payments for schools from all classes in all schools. So the government is now operating in a very, very minimal revenue situation, almost zero revenue. We are lucky we have substantial reserves that have been built up through our citizenship program over previous years. We were in a good debt situation, but we are, of course, requesting debt relief, delay of payments. We are looking for assistance from our development partners. Many have come forward. We're very thankful for that. But also you've got to understand that Vanuatu is scheduled to graduate from least developed country status in December. And so that's another thing we've now decided, well, with this situation, are we ready? Can we request either further deferment of our graduation or a longer transition period? And that's something also the government is working on now to request back to the United Nations. So those are some of the issues, Kevin, that I would just like to raise from a national perspective.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I appreciate that. Let me go in the next 10 or 15 minutes to a couple of shorter questions, and I'd appreciate a series of answers to the extent that you're comfortable in delivering them. Meg, if I could just ask you this. On COVID-19, if you were sending a simple message to Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Japan, your principal development partners, about what you need most in terms of, let's call it, COVID-19 medical supplies, and what you need most in terms of economic assistance now, what would your message be, given that we'll have a number of people tuning in to this webinar? Your thoughts?
I think I'd mentioned that earlier that what we really need is this the personal equipment, our protective equipment. And that still stands. And Ralph has mentioned about the testing kits, and not all countries have got testing kits. I was advised yesterday. Many have, but we still need more supplies. However, I understand there's a global shortage of these testing kits. But if Australia and New Zealand, and they've been very supportive of our countries, and we're all very thankful, that we can get more of those. But we've also had other donors too from different parts of the Pacific that have been very supportive. And China has brought in lots of aid and medical support and financial assistance to the countries that they have diplomatic relations with. Where I sit at the Secretariat, we got a shipment of medical supplies from the Jack Ma Foundation, several tons worth, particularly for the countries that have the cases. And we are now ensuring that they get shipped to ports where they can be picked up by the member states and taken back to their countries.
On the, Ralph mentioned this before, but do you have a perspective on how, if we were able to develop, let's call it a Pacific bubble, that is, first of all, the Australia-New Zealand bubble in terms of the relaxation of travel arrangements between those two countries, if and when that becomes possible, as originally suggested by the New Zealand Prime Minister, on how that could be then operationalized across the Pacific Island countries over time. What thinking has gone into that so far, Meg? I'd appreciate your thoughts.
I've not had a conversation with governments on this, but I know that several governments have approached Australia and New Zealand that they be included in this bubble, particularly because to get the tourism business going again, and showing that they've contained the COVID cases, and for Vanuatu particularly, they have not had any. But I think the biggest challenge is when there is a fear about outsiders coming in, or even if it's within a bubble, is how does the country then prepare itself to open up? And this is where SPCs come in and provided guidance to countries so that they can consider how they will open up. And
SPCs are what?
It's the technical organisation, the Pacific Community, that does this kind of work, and has been a fantastic organisation that has been really playing a big role in this. And the issues here, and of course WHO gives guidance to countries as well. And I was going through some of that documentation, and one thing that really hit me was this, and this is where there is a weakness in many Pacific countries, is that we just don't have strong health systems, health services, and health infrastructure. And if you're going to open up, you've got to have some kind of security there so that anyone coming into your country and your citizens as well feel secure enough that they will be taken care of if there is a case that comes into the country. I think that many of the Pacific countries hope that over time this will open up and our trade relationships will begin again within the Pacific and with Australia and New Zealand, and flights will commence again, and more ships will start moving across the ocean. But I think it's going to take time. I don't think there's, first of all, it's making sure that people stay healthy in the countries.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. Just building on those answers, Meg, before I come back to Ralph in a minute, how significant has Chinese assistance been to the Pacific Island countries since COVID hit across the region, nationally, regionally? Have you got a sense of PPE overall supply? You mentioned the Jack Ma Foundation, economic assistance. Give us some sense of overview of that.
Oh, well, I think the Jack Ma Foundation, it was very much, we reached out to them and they supplied to the Pacific Island Forum to go to the countries that had it. But China itself has been very active with the countries that it has diplomatic relations. I don't have exact figures of what went into each country. I think that will come out as we get through this time and doing our own economic analysis of the situation, where the impact and where the donors came from. But of course, the countries have also been depending on the multilateral development banks for grants as well as for finance to help them with their stimulus packages, and now preparing more for what the recovery phase would look like. But the Pacific will be hurting in this. As I said, many countries depend on remittances from its citizens or people from their islands that work in different countries, and remittances is taking a really hard hit. And if your economy depends on up to 40% of your GDP on remittances coming in, you're going to be hard hit. But China is very much seen as a partner in all this, as well as other countries, and of course the two larger ones of the membership of the Pacific Island Forum, Australia and New Zealand.
Good, thank you for that. Ralph, you mentioned before in some detail the impact of Tropical Cyclone Harold, not just on Vanuatu, but across other countries in Melanesia, Solomons, as well as the impact on Fiji. This, of course, brings into sharp relief the pre-existing state of the economy, the challenges which Meg has just spoken about in terms of continuing remittances. I'm pleased to have been the Prime Minister which introduced the Seasonal Workers Program between Australia and the Pacific Island countries, against a fair bit of political reaction and hostility at the time in this country, but I'm glad it's become normalised to a reasonable extent, and therefore it's been able to be sustained during this very difficult period. But it does go to the fundamental question of the degree of economic vulnerability. The number which I found quite arresting before in what you said, which was 40 to 50% of Vanuatu's GDP being tourism dependent, points to a huge hole in Vanuatu's GDP numbers and therefore employment prospects for the year ahead. Speaking from Vanuatu's point of view, what particular requests are you putting forward to the international community, to Australia and New Zealand for direct economic and financial assistance at this time? And how useful have the development banks been in responding to your current circumstances in your own country?
Well, we've been, of course, reaching out for assistance, both in terms of relief and response to TC Harrow, but also to help us with the economic stimulus package, which I want to stress is largely from domestic sources, but we have received support from the development banks and also our development partners. I think some of the things that we are looking for now are things like we need to talk about what are the protocols we're going to put in place to be able to start moving people through the Pacific, this whole bubble idea. We want to be a part of that, obviously. We are obviously also very, very cautious about being part of it to maintain our COVID-free status. Also, the SWP and RSC continues to be a major income for the country. And we need to be able to see how that's going to work in the future. How can we make sure that that program, which it brings great benefits to our country, but also to Australia and New Zealand, how can we make that more effective, enhance the way in which benefits accrue to all the countries? I think I want to come back also to the very important and pertinent point made by Dame Meg, which is that our health systems very much have not been up to scratch. And this is an existing problem. And as I said previously, these kind of disasters just show you how deficient you are in these sectors. So one of the most important things we need to do now is to be able to facilitate verified testing for COVID, get that capacity. So, because that affects the ability to participate in the bubble, it affects our capacity to start people crossing our borders. But also we need very, very many additional resources in our public health sector to strengthen it, to strengthen our health infrastructure. We have got a lot of support in that area from our donors, our partners, China, Australia. We are now in the process of setting up intensive care units. We have set up facilities for staffing for any staff that have to deal with cases of infection, so they don't have to go home. China was able to build us some infrastructure for that. But still there is a long way to go, and we need a lot of help in building the health sector. So I think this is something which I think would be a priority for us at this particular point in time, is to get our health system up to a standard where, along with the testing, we can be ready to face the rest of the world when it is time to do so.
The policy linkages here are fairly clear, aren't they? Number one, you and the Pacific have done remarkably well in early closure of borders. In fact, SG, you mentioned to me in an earlier conversation the deep learnings across the Pacific region from the measles outbreak much earlier last century, and how this permeated much of the folkloric culture of the wider region, and about the need to lock down communities rapidly to avoid a repeat of that disastrous pandemic all those decades ago. And you and the region, it strikes me, have done remarkably well, given that there is a lack of development of the public health infrastructure. But the fact that across all of the 14 island states of the 16 member states, independent states of the Pacific Island region, you have 6 or 7 deaths and 200 or 300 infections. I mean, this is quite remarkable. So your success there, of course, exists in mirror image to the economic challenge you now have. because the lockdown has been fairly effective with the international community. So you go now to the mechanics of economic recovery and engineering the Pacific bubble that we've just been speaking about. There seem to me, in my mind, a couple of models which this could be advanced with. One is for points of exit into the Pacific Island countries out of Australia and New Zealand for tourism purposes. That testing protocols are established at each of the departure points so that a would-be traveller from Australia and New Zealand into the region has to provide evidence that they have been tested and certified to be COVID-19 free before they travel into the region. And that would need to be done 24 hours thereabouts before they travel. And that certification would be provided that at Brisbane Airport, at Sydney Airport, at Auckland Airport, etc. The alternative is, of course, for all that to be done on arrival, which might be more problematic given that people will have arrived and whoops, if I suddenly test COVID-19 positive, I have a problem. And then you have a quarantine problem on your hands as well. But Meg, Ralph, it strikes me that this is because there are a limited number of airports affected, principally, correct me if I'm wrong, Brisbane, Sydney, Auckland, into the region, that this could be done at an airport level with cooperation between the Forum Secretariat and the Australian New Zealand governments in order to make that possible. The reverse strikes me as a little harder to organise, that is at the Pacific Island end. But I just throw that out as a couple of ideas for SG for you to think about and Ralph for you to think about as well. Meg, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think I've been very cautious about this because I think the countries have made it very clear to me that whatever happens on protocols with regard to even technical teams coming in, repatriation, etc., that they are the ones that will call the shots. And as Ralph has indicated, that they want to be part of it, but they're very cautious. And I think it's a caution of how this will all happen. And I think what you say, will give us food for thought to be able to think about where those entry points are in terms of moving people. But right now, though, there are some airlines from the Pacific that are moving cargo, and there are ships that are still going across the Pacific and trading into Australia. But to move it more widely, we're going to need something that will stimulate our economies, and one will be how we get trade going again. Between ourselves, it's small, but we trade a lot with Australia and New Zealand, and the feedback I have from our trade commissioners in Australia and New Zealand is that this is going to take about 6 to 12 months to really get this settled down, and then for the trade to open up. There's a caution about it. But how, so I'm sure people who are listening to us are thinking, well, how are all these people in the islands going to survive? Well, it's amazing. Suva, everybody's planting. From Nassori into Suva, including me, we're all planting food. And I'm sure it's the same in Vanuatu. Many parts of the Pacific are looking at being self-reliant. That doesn't keep economies going. You go to the markets are expensive. You see people who've lost their jobs really, really hurting and suffering when we don't have the kind of rigor of our social security network. But our social security networks, in terms of people, is that we rely on our extended families, we rely on our communities, and we've always supported each other. And those of us, or people who have jobs, looking after other people who don't. And if it's going to take 1 year, 2 years, I think the Pacific will come through. But of course, we want to see our economies and the tourism business start, because that's a huge income earner for the Pacific, and it's what we've got, is the beauty of our countries to be able to share with others.
Thank you for that. By the way, my wife Therese has planted a veggie garden as well, Meg. So we now have we've got tomatoes and zucchinis. I can see them out the window here. Doing very well, I've got to say. Before we go to questions put to us by the online audience, to conclude this part of our dialogue on climate change. Ralph, you and others in the Pacific have been, in my own argument, critical of Australian postures on climate change. For example, this position of the Morrison government and I think its predecessors on the use of carbon credits, for example, for its own Paris commitments and the honouring thereof. I'd appreciate your views on that and what pressure the Pacific Island countries will be bringing to bear on Australia in particular, but also the international community in terms of this challenge, which doesn't disappear because of COVID and doesn't disappear because of the current impact on jobs. Ralph, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the Pacific has always been very strong on global action on climate change. And while we seem to be in a bit of a pause because of COVID, this doesn't in any way lessen our concern and our call to all countries of the world, and in particular, Australia, which is our big neighbour right next door, to step up, raise ambition, start doing something really serious about reducing emissions, reducing a contribution to world emissions, so that we can start talking about effectively dealing with climate change and perhaps stopping the runaway that it has become. So just before COVID, we were all talking about climate change. That dialogue has sort of been a bit muted now, but those concerns definitely remain because it is still, as the forum leaders have said, the greatest threat to our region. It still remains the greatest threat to our region, even more than I would say COVID does, because we seem to have managed COVID so far well. Whereas climate change, as Tropical Cyclone Harold showed, we have definitely not got that under control, and we will continue to be greatly impacted by the effects of climate change. So definitely it remains at the top of our agenda, and we will continue to press with our partners and the international community to try and take the strongest measures possible.
Meg, on climate, do you have any reflections yourself?
I think that, the Pacific Island Forum in Tuvalu last year was very clear about its position on climate change. It still is the greatest threat to the Pacific. And we want to make sure that the temperatures do not go above 1.5 degrees in terms of above the pre-industrial levels. But we're seeing that in 2019 temperatures were 1.28, so we've got to be watching what is going on. The transition from fossil fuels, of course, that the Pacific countries have insisted on. And of course, the commitments of the Paris Agreement, as Ralph has said, that they are met. And, conversations in the Pacific is that COVID has come, it's shown our vulnerabilities, but the climate issue is not going away. And I think the concern is that once things settle down with regard to COVID, is that industrialized countries go back to a way of life that is just going to exacerbate climate change again and climate issues again. And then you hear of more coal mines going to be opened, etc. Well, what are the lessons we're going to learn from all this? The Pacific has had to learn hard lessons from all this. And I mean, for Vanuatu and Solomons and Fiji to be hit with Cyclone Harold in the middle of this is just devastating, and to watch it and just to see the despair and know that people are without shelter, without food, etc. The climate remains the most important and serious threat to this region. And for our atoll countries, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and Republic of Marshall Islands, those atoll countries are the most vulnerable, and we've got to make sure that we do everything to protect all our, we are as strong as our weakest link in terms of the health of our peoples.
Well, I'd certainly continue to encourage the Pacific Island Forum to remain active globally. Going back to even the Copenhagen conference 10 years ago, the position then taken by Kiribati on behalf of the Pacific Island Forum, and in the period since then by the Marshall Islands, other countries within the region, I would simply say to all of our friends tuning in from the region itself that the voice of the Pacific is actually heard in New York, it's heard in Europe, it's heard in America, because you are so much at the front line. So continuing your activism on this is critical to pushing the dial forward as far as substantive action around the world. So I'd encourage you in that direction. We've got just on 10 minutes left. I've got a few questions here from those who have been tuned into our webinar. And so I will go through them in fairly rapid fire. And so, and I'll point them in one direction or the other. And perhaps if we could keep our answers down to less than a minute, we should be able to get through them. We have a question from Dev Netkani on Facebook asking about high tariffs on sanitizer products. His question in particular is, can they be waived or at least lowered so that these are affordable to both institutions and individuals throughout the islands? Can these be channeled through the humanitarian pathway as well? Meg, you might have a go at that one. Sanitizer products, tariffs.
I think the Pacific governments are very keen to earn what they can from bringing in products from externally. When they come in through the WHO and are delivered to countries for health purposes, I am not sure whether they tariffs are imposed then, but we can look into that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's worth looking at. A question from Justin Johnson on Facebook, both asking about what is being done with Australia's establishment of an infrastructure bank for the Pacific, which was announced back in November of 2018. Meg, Ralph, I'll leave it to either of you to answer that one.
Ralph, do you want to go?
No, well, I don't know what's been done. So it's one for you, Meg.
That's called the hospital part. Back to you, Meg.
Well, I understand that a lot of work was being done on the creation of it and how they were going to roll this out. But in the meantime, we too at the Pacific Island Forum have been working on a similar kind of infrastructure institution, but really to look at how to raise money, looking at the GDP of our countries multiplied by 5, and then raising funds so that you invest in the resilience of communities, so that the communities had money, and it would be through our member states. We look forward to the infrastructure bank getting off the ground and hoping that it will help, particularly where it's needed now in terms of getting the economies off the ground again.
Now, a question from Alfred Schuster on Facebook. Is there an opportunity to also focus the Pacific's attention on investing in the skills needed among Pacific peoples to revive economies and to address the unemployment challenge? You might have some thoughts on this, Ralph, given what you've just spoken about earlier in terms of the Vanuatu economic package. Your thoughts?
Most definitely, this is something that is now being given very, very serious consideration. I mean, it was always on the agenda, but now we've been forced to take it much more seriously and invest in it. I think, as Meg was saying, what's happening in Fiji, very much so the same thing happening here, trying to look more at agriculture, look more at value adding, look more at internal domestic trade. For example, disaster relief. Okay, let's see what other parts of the country can provide instead of importing food from outside. So very much trying to build up this domestic economy, which can survive and provide livelihoods in situations like this, where we see the border shut down and the tourism pretty much collapse. It's really been a wake-up call. I mean, we've been doing a lot of this already. It just kind of re-emphasizes that how vulnerable that sector is, how vulnerable reliance on outside is, and the strengths we have in our traditional economy, how it supports the majority of the population. These are themes I've always talked about, and it's good to see that, unfortunately, we're forced to give them greater consideration, but they are now coming much more to the fore in terms of discussions about policy across government and also in the private sector, and also in terms of how do we rebuild our economy after this in a way that recognizes the dangers that we've now seen and the consequences we've seen from over-reliance on certain sectors, particularly tourism, particularly imports of food, etc.
Thanks very much for that, Ralph. Question from Tess Newton-Kane on Facebook asking, given what we are hearing about hopes and concerns about Pacific countries being part of a travel bubble, should the Pacific themselves, I presume meaning the Forum Secretariat or national governments, be invited to join the Australia and New Zealand expert group looking at this? I think that one's probably back to you, Meg. Understanding the cautionary advice that you were providing us before about the conservative attitude of island countries about reopening in general. But specifically, the question is, would it be good for the Secretariat to be part of the Australia-New Zealand expert group looking at the future of a travel bubble? Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you to Tess for that question. And if we were invited, we would, of course, take part, because I think it's important for the future. But the final decisions are always made by our member states and the island countries.
Okay, so I'll simply say via the Bush Telegraph here in Australia and across the Tasman, Wellington and Canberra might take note of that in the polite language of our regional diplomacy. Karen Baker on Facebook asks to Meg, is women's participation decision-making a priority for the Pacific Island Forum in responding to both climate change and COVID-19? Meg?
Of course, yes, it is. And I'm just trying to find the best way to say, to respond to this. Particularly, I chair the, oh dear, the Pacific Partnership, which is made up of organizations, about 80 civil society organizations, but led by the UN Women, supported by Australia, New Zealand, particularly on women's issues throughout the region, but particularly focused on violence against women. And the area that we've been talking about, particularly with regard to COVID, is that we're seeing an exacerbation of tensions and violence in families because of loss of income, the pressures on families. And even in the institution I work, my staff, we're working virtually, but they've requested support and counselling, etc. So we're looking at it through that lens very much to support them. In terms of the climate change, it's very much at the regional level, and the consultations that governments have in terms of the development of their climate policies, that women's organisations participate in that. And I'm sure Ralph has got an answer for that in terms of how women in Vanuatu are very much involved in the climate change issues. So I'll pass to Ralph.
Ralph, if you've got a word or two on that, we've got a couple of minutes left, that's all, but over to you.
Well, unfortunately, we remain, after our last election last month, one of maybe 2 countries in the world with no women MPs. So I don't think I'm very qualified to talk about women in political leadership, but definitely women are the backbone of the social web that is now becoming much more active in this time of crisis. And we're seeing a lot of excellent leadership coming from women at all levels in the administration, but also for me as a member of parliament, particularly in the communities that I work with. It's generally I'm working much more with the women in coming up with solutions to how we're going to make sure that everyone who's been affected gets to survive, gets to continue to maintain their families in this current period where a lot of unemployment, a lot of crisis, access to food from gardens and that kind of thing. It seems that women are taking much more greater leadership role that makes an impact in terms of how government sees it.
And just to reinforce what Meg said before, I think around the world, including Australia and New Zealand, I'm very mindful of the region as well, Pacific Island, the real challenges of domestic violence in this period, and the need for proper support services through the churches and through other institutions to support women who are now being asked to handle a whole range of new challenges, quite apart from those which existed before. Colleagues, we're near to the end of our time. We've got heaps of other questions. Jill Scanlon, Catherine Mitchie Lee. One last one from Wes Morgan. I'll close with this to you, Ralph. It's a pretty direct, in-your-face question, but you're a guy from politics, so off you go. Quote, Wes Morgan says, would Australia improve its global standing if it joined the Pacific Island countries and worked with island states as a bloc to lead multilateral diplomacy to raise global ambition to tackle climate change, unquote. I did not set this question up. It is simply spontaneously erupted from the ether. So I'll leave our independent public servant Secretary General to one side and ask you, Ralph, the politician, to answer that one.
Absolutely. And we welcome that. This is what we want to see happen. So absolutely, yes.
That's good. Well, I always have a simple view since my own period in office that in the world, we can pack a big punch on climate diplomacy when you have a couple of developed countries like Australia and New Zealand working in complete harness with our friends, brothers and sisters in the developing countries of the Pacific Island region. That carries a powerful message to the world if we're able to make that happen in the future. Our time has come and gone. Meg Taylor, Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, thank you for your time. Ralph Regenvanu, former Foreign Minister of Vanuatu, now leader of the opposition in that important country in the region, thank you for your time. And for all of you who have been part of this Asia Society Policy Institute webinar series on the impact of COVID-19 on the countries and communities of our wider region, thank you for your participation as well. And we'll bring our webinar to a close at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.